Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Renaud Evrard. I'm an assistant professor in psychology and currently the president of the Parapsychological Association. And I found funny to speak about parapsychology as pseudoscience uh, because I want to highlight the public understanding of parapsychology. So my first slide is about the way parapsychologists purport to apply scientific method to the investigation of commonly reported exceptional experiences and phenomena. But despite over 100 years of associated research effort, the status of parapsychology as a scientific endeavor is disputed by a substantial section of the contemporary mainstream scientific community. We often blame other scientists for such a bad situation, but it seems to be less regrettable and surprising when it is placed in a larger context. In fact, many people perceive the study of human behavior as unscientific. As a cousin discipline of psychology, parapsychology must also undergo the same representation. In fact, there is a lot of new literature about the way psychology has a perception problems. And the more relevant article is one by Scott Lilienfeld in 2012. These articles argue that psychological science is experiencing a public perception problem that has been caused by both public misconception about psychology, as well as the psychological science community's failure to distinguish itself from pop psychology and questionable therapeutic practices. Ferguson's article in 2015 used this quote in his title, "Everybody knows psychology is not a real science." And currently several researchers are searching to document this public skepticism about psychology. Lilienfeld examined 6 basic forms of skeptical claims against psychology. Psychology is merely common sense. Psychology doesn't use scientific methods. Psychology cannot yield meaningful generalization because everyone is unique. Psychology does not yield repeatable results. Psychology cannot make precise prediction, and psychology is not useful to the society. The data show that this form of skepticism are widespread in the general population. We are missing similar data regarding parapsychology, but it will be interesting to know if the skepticism that parapsychology encounters differs significantly from this anti-psychology skepticism that splash over us. Lilienfeld offers rebuttals to this form of basic skepticism. For instance, in contradiction to the claim that psychology is merely common sense, he had collected over 300 examples where psychology findings violate popular wisdom. And in his article, he gave a sample of psychological misconception with the percentage of surveyed undergraduate participants who understood each one. In a similar way, we should work in parapsychology on the multiple misconceptions about the field, even if parapsychologists themselves fail to reach hard consensus about several aspects of their field. Lilienfeld also addressed 8 potential sources of public skepticism toward psychology: the psychologist's failure to police itself, the problematic public face of psychology, confusion between psychologists and psychotherapists, insight bias, the illusion of understanding, greedy reductionism, the scientific impotence excuse, the way people discount scientific evidence that disconfirms an important belief by understanding the idea that scientific methods are unable to address that topic. And the last one is the failure to distinguish basic from applied research. Don't we have symmetrical problems within parapsychology? So this is the way I construct my idea, is to apply the same kind of study of the understanding of science inside parapsychology. There is a lot of research. I will not go in deep detail, but there is also in the article of Lilienfeld 4 reasons why non-psychology skepticism about psychology is important. and why we should care about that. First, such knowledge can forearm psychologists when encountering resistance about psychological findings from students, therapy clients, or laypersons. In this way, such knowledge can equip psychologists with intellectual ammunition against misguided criticism of their field. Second, such knowledge may allow psychologists to anticipate commonplace objections to psychological research from policymakers and help psychologists explain the pragmatic and theoretical significance of their research to outsiders. Third, such knowledge is valuable in its own right because it sheds light on the psychological sources of resistance to the scientific study of human nature. In this respect, it may help us to grasp why so many educated individuals find psychology to be unscientific. And four, such knowledge may aid psychologists in crafting recommendations for counteracting public and policymakers' misunderstandings of psychology. So I move from this field of public understanding of psychology to the one of parapsychology. What is the perception in the general population of parapsychology? I want to develop the same kind of perspective, but as we have seen, there is a huge skepticism in the world community, but the most study we have came from people in elite groups, like other scientists. Parapsychology has been called unscientific, pseudoscientific, anti-scientific enterprise, and beyond the epistemological debate about the scientific status of parapsychology, we should regard these claims as social phenomena, building the current image of this discipline. From the public, I just put like 7 ideas, 7 motives against parapsychology that we can find, because at first I was expecting more people to be more encouraging to parapsychology, but because there is a lot of people that share beliefs and experiences about paranormal phenomena. But we see, however, a huge discrepancy between these personal events and the consideration of a scientific discipline dedicated to their studies. People who endorse paranormal beliefs and experience may have obvious interest in supporting a scientific recognition of a discipline that helps them to be taken seriously, but this support is mostly lacking. And the motive for that may be that people in general share the scientific skepticism. They agree to say that parapsychology failed to become a true scientific discipline. They can say that the scientific impotence excuse too, like the paranormal domain is outside the scientific scope. They can be very interested in pseudo-parapsychology, a misconceived parapsychology as an applied practice devoted to the development of paranormal powers, or they can be disappointed by parapsychology study because it's too monotone or too complex. There's also a social prejudice. People keep their paranormal sphere in their intimacy, as there is a social taboo preventing its sharing. And there may be to a scientific disengagement in general. It's not specific to parapsychology, but few lay people develop a scientific culture, reading scientific journals, becoming members of scholar societies. So this largely applies to all scientific disciplines, and it's not typical for parapsychology. And there can be too a lack of opportunity. Why some people may be interested by scientific parapsychology, they rarely get in touch with it. These motives combine well with each other to suppress the massive support we should expect from this vast majority of people who understand paranormal belief and experience. But we have some other data, because we don't have for the previous motive, but we have some answer from scientists from the studies of McLennan on Wagner and Monet. And they show that the scientific legitimacy of parapsychology has been shown to be rejected more strongly by some members of the scientific elites, and more strongly by psychologists than by other scientists. 44% were believers, while 56 of all social scientists in the study fell in that category. So this survey, but if they are quite old, no, maybe we can update them, show that a specific kind of group, the elite scientists or a specific kind of population, have strong prejudice against parapsychology. And mostly they explain their prejudice because of a personal worldview. Sometimes they have some belief and experience themselves. Sometimes it's only a belief or unbelief in this kind. So we have some of a kind of study that will help us to understand and justify why people have this kind of prejudice for or against parapsychology. And one study, very recent and very interesting, was conducted by Bethany Butler, and she studied the bias in the evaluation of identical abstracts framed as parapsychological or as neuroscientific. 100 participants with a background in psychology were randomly assigned to read and evaluate one of two virtually identical study abstracts, and the result revealed that participants rate the neuroscience abstract as having stronger feelings and as being more valid and reliable than the parapsychology abstract, despite the fact that the two abstracts were identical. And she did some exploratory study to understand that and show that the trait transcendentalism, assessed through the belief about questionnaire and reality questionnaire, mediates the evaluation of the research. People, individuals with high transcendentalist beliefs may be more likely to evaluate parapsychological research in a more favorable manner. In sum, the preferred belief reinforces this bias. This confirms the notion that belief contradictory information is resisted, which is supported by a great deal of research in this area of bias assimilation. The Butler study confirms previous studies. I don't go deeper into that, but we have a study of Gustein and Brazis with 1,000 psychologists evaluating again identical abstracts on astrology with opposite result and conclusion, and people have preference regarding their own previous beliefs. We have some research by color opposing parapsychologists and skeptics, evaluating a fictional report of a Gansfeld peace studies with manipulation of the methodological quality, and skeptics judged in line with their prior beliefs. Chris Rowe did a similar study with psychology graduate students, and Egovich recently did a study with an abstract that predicts behavior through astrology, and he assessed if psychologists rate the abstracts as being of higher quality or more appropriate when the results confirm their expectation. In short, we have some studies that show that there is strong bias against parapsychology, but most of these studies use at least students or confirmed scientists. And we don't have any data about the general population in fact. So I think we need more study with the general population. I don't talk about all the other kind of study, but they are very interesting about the way these bias are influenced by the source credibility, influenced by perceptual bias. If you have a belief against or for paranormal phenomena, this will change the way you can see things. It's a study of Simon Moore that shows that. And its impact all the scientific assessment of parapsychology. For instance, in the process of peer review, these biases have been shown to be very effective. So I did a small survey in French to bring some data to all this aspect. My survey was a new questionnaire I created with 28 Likert 5 questions and 10 open items seeking illustration of the participant knowledge. In fact, I use the knowledge, attitude, and practice paradigm. That is to say that I assess the attitudes for or against parapsychology, but I also have item checking some key knowledge of the people to support their own beliefs in attitudes. And I hypothesize that the level of knowledge is an essential component of the structuration of a representation. That seems quite logical, in fact. What I use is only a basic definition of parapsychology as the study of ESP and PK at the beginning, and then the items were about perimeters of parapsychology, what is the domain of the field, the way parapsychology and scientificity interact, parapsychology and skepticism, on education, on the development of parapsychology, and I gave a free text zone devoted to the participant description of parapsychology in its own word. And I display through social media this short questionnaire, and 89 people respond with a mean age 42. I use a two-test student test for an unique sample to check if the people give real answer that deviate significantly from the standard neutral answer 3, because it was a Likert 5 again. And from the general response of the population, I found that people on average understand that parapsychology is not a training of psychic ability, that the phenomena are quite the same, but in all times, and they are not produced by entities, and that the survival issue is quite beyond the scope of parapsychology. So it's a quite good, appropriate representation of what is going on. About scientificity, on average, people think that parapsychology is not based only on testimonies, but they are unsure if parapsychology use scientific methods. They don't think parapsychologists achieve to obtain reproducible results or precise prediction through theoretical models. Their opinion is that parapsychologists don't make a proper use of quantum theory to explain the phenomena. According to them, parapsychological journals are below the standards of other academic journals, and parapsychologists are not seen as true scientists. As a whole, parapsychology is not perceived as a scientific discipline recognized by the scientific community and don't really make any blatant progress. People are not sure that paranormal phenomena escape to the attempt to control them objectively. The elusiveness hypothesis is not shared in the population. About skepticism, on average, people think parapsychology doesn't represent a general threat, so that's a good idea. They don't know if skeptics provide adequate criticism of parapsychology, but they believe that skeptics have done some experimental work to check reality of psych phenomena. Regarding sources of information, they are not sure if parapsychology is favored or not by the medias, and Wikipedia is mostly disregarded as a reliable source of information on the topic. About parapsychology and education, most participants admit that they are not trained into parapsychology. They are quite unsure, in fact, if educational opportunities exist in academic settings, and they are also unsure if parapsychology may have a place there. Development of parapsychology, on average, parapsychological's lack of financial support is not considered as a real issue. You have enough money to do what you have to do. And whereas the utility of parapsychology for the society is all but obvious. Military and intelligence interests for parapsychological application appear unknown, and it's quite uncertain that parapsychology may contribute to our general understanding of the world, but it's clear for the people that the profession of parapsychologist is critically not recognized. So this short data from this survey can be analyzed in another way. It's when I compare this kind of attitudes to the knowledge, the key element of knowledge that people have. And for doing that, I just give some basic question like, please give me the name of a parapsychologist, of a skeptics, of a typical experimental paradigm parapsychology, a journal, an university, educational opportunity, anything. And I have to use my quite expert knowledge to categorize wrong and right answers, so maybe it's a bias. And the percentage of answering to these knowledge items, it's much lower than for the other opinion items. And I give them a relative score because it's the correct answer divided by all the answer that people gave me, and an absolute score, the correct answer divided by the total of participants who had the opportunity to reply. When I ask them, for instance, to name a parapsychologist, 70% give a correct answer, mostly a non-French researcher, Radin, Ryan, Dessoir, Wiseman, name as known. But the absolute score is only 37. So one people on 3 know one parapsychologist. The wrong answer was psychic, like Uri Geller, named as a parapsychologist, or Kardec, Freud, Zener, Warren Coppel, anything. When I asked them to name a skeptic, there was a 56% of absolute score. So it's the item where most of the people reply among the knowledge items, and most correct answers were named of French language mediatic skeptics like Henri Brock, Jean-Michel Abrassard, Thomas Durand, Gérard Majax. I don't think anyone know them outside France, but some foreign skeptics were also quoted, Wiseman and Randy. It's easier for the French public to identify a local and vocal skeptics than a local researcher in parapsychology. The first available and widespread knowledge about parapsychology comes from the skeptical perspective. This is one point. When I ask them to identify one parapsychological journals, you will have the Bourse score, the relative score, and the absolute score. And in fact, to each question, the level of correct answer was very low. It was between at least less than a quarter of the panel have some basic knowledge about parapsychology. When I ask an experimental paradigm, a theoretical model, a reference book, at least there is always some bad answer in general. And people find that the questionnaire was very hard for them because it asked very difficult questions. So people were also unable to describe one progress made by parapsychology, or to identify one training into parapsychology, one experimental research done by a skeptics, and they rely mainly on mediatic paranormal challenge like Randy Prize, which is very well known, or magician debunkings of psychic, or some amateurish opportunist studies made by French skeptics, dietitians, which are not published in peer-reviewed journals. So people have some kind of knowledge of parapsychology, but mainly it's amateur things. The general observation is that misconceptions regarding parapsychology have a high prevalence in general population. Then I did a subgroup analysis introducing one variable, the self-assess level of knowledge. I just asked them if they think they know something about parapsychology and if they are trained into parapsychology. And 53 of the 89 participants claimed that they were familiar with the field, but most of the time they are not trained to it, but they know something. And when I check that, we can find some small divergence in attitude between the familiar group and the unfamiliar group. But the most interesting results come when you are comparing the knowledge. Familiar people are contributing the most to the total positive score because they have systematically better knowledge of key components of the field than unfamiliar people. So that's a good point. If you claim to know something about parapsychology, maybe in fact you know something about parapsychology and you have better answer about that. But I have to go deeper, and then I subdivide again this group of familiar people between the proponent and the skeptics. And I did that only from one item, the item 11, who asked, are parapsychological researchers genuine scientists? So it's using only to test the prejudice against the parapsychologist's scientificity. If you believe that parapsychologists may be scientists, you are a proponent. And if you believe the contrary, you are a skeptic in these label groups. when I did that, you can find something that we are arguing for in the community, is that some people claim to know something about parapsychology, but in fact, they only know one side of the thing, only know the skeptical side. And this shows very strong difference in attitudes against parapsychology. The attitude that changed is regarding the perimeter of parapsychology. They don't see the field as the same size. Skeptics think that parapsychology don't help to develop psi abilities. They think that the scientificity of parapsychology is worse than anything else. Parapsychology is not based only, in fact, for people who claim to be proponents of parapsychology, parapsychology is not based only on testimonial because it's based on scientific methods too. But for skeptics, it's not clear like that. They heard only about testimonies in parapsychology, and they are quite uncertain about the use of scientific methods in the field. They think that the production of replicable results is not there in parapsychology currently, and they think that the scientificity of parapsychological journal is very low. In the same vein, our clear-cut item 11 distinguished in total 19 attitudes that show significant divergence regarding parapsychology between the proponent and the skeptics groups. So that shows in general that we have to detect two particular variables. The first one is those people claim to know something about parapsychology, and all they see or are their prejudice against the scientificity of parapsychologists. When you use the same groups of proponents and skeptics and you measure, you assess their knowledge of parapsychology, in fact, the proponents have much better score in K knowledge components of parapsychology than skeptics group. The difference is quite always significative in the sense of proponents, but only the skeptics did better when the task was to name a skeptics. So they know better people in their field. I will go to my conclusion, and I hope to publish the paper to give someone, to everyone the opportunity to look to the data. The public understanding of parapsychology is not well developed yet. In fact, it's very funny because in parapsychology, we have Richard Wiseman at Hertfordshire University, who hold an academic position of professor in public understanding of psychology. But beyond his case, the topic of public understanding of science have received little attention inside parapsychology, and we are lacking empirical research because the current one are mainly focused on scientists and not on lay people. But in the vein of research on social representation, we should expect a very different picture if we really face the image of parapsychology in other social categories. The public understanding needs to be explored with over-enthusiastic reception of parapsychological research, often merged with all kinds of paranormal and supernatural claims, but the study of the impacts of disbelief on misconception should not be forgotten. The study of bias against parapsychology and their correlates is a fruitful way which may serve to prevent the dissemination of such bias on further arguments for the legitimacy of the field. To identify widespread misconception about parapsychology, offer us some targets for public education and information. Such knowledge may aid parapsychologists in crafting recommendations for counteracting public and policymakers' misunderstanding of the field. Nevertheless, we should develop a larger perspective than the one found in the line of the demarcation issue. Many more questions should be asked about the social representation of parapsychology than the ones who concern only researchers in their specific environment. Indeed, public understanding of parapsychology invites us in a reflexive anomalistics, as developed by Scheich, Meyer, and Schnitter. Developing our understanding of public representation of parapsychology may change our feelings of rejection and taboo In fact, we may gather empirical data comparable to those of the cousin discipline of psychology that help to settle a baseline for the appreciation of depreciation of the characteristic of the parapsychological field. And the French pedopsychiatrist Paul Rabéron, who is giving an introductory course to parapsychology in Lyon for 25 years now, highlight that the main interest to develop what he called a common cultural baggage among students from every discipline and free listeners beyond an academic context. Such a baggage of common knowledge about exceptional experiences and paranormal belief may also prevent some of the negative consequences of this phenomena in mental health. Other possible issue, I will just put a final aspect. So this is the definition of reflexive anomalistic and common cultural baggage and baseline. What I need to cover too is maybe we have to think about the ethical and methodological interest of this prejudice against parapsychology. For instance, with the development of cover studies, not asking to the participant in an experimental paradigm but they are doing some side task because it's very challenging from their worldview, and maybe it's like an impossible mission. It's strange, ridiculous. Maybe we have to just put the way as an implicit side task. All in all, it seems very relevant for parapsychologists to take an authentic scientific interest to lay people's view on parapsychology, not only in order to seduce them for commercial and political purpose. I thank you for your attention.